The October wind tore across the Kansas prairie as a lone widow dragged a handcart of firewood through the Flint Hills, racing the fading light.
By late afternoon, her hands were bleeding, and the cart held barely 2 days of fuel. Then the ground disappeared beneath her boot. She tumbled 8 feet down a rocky slope, scattering shale and losing her axe in the fall. As she struggled upright, something behind a wall of thorny plum bushes caught her eye. Leaves. Beyond them, hidden inside the hillside, stood the entrance to an abandoned underground shelter.
In January of 1888, on the 4th morning after the sky cracked open, a man named Denton Crow stood at the edge of his own porch in Bitter Fork, Kansas, staring at a world he no longer recognized. The blizzard had buried the prairie under drifts tall enough to swallow fence posts, reshape barns into white mounds, press against window panes with the slow insistence of something alive. The silence that followed 3 days of shrieking wind was the worst part. It had a weight to it. It sat on a man's chest. Crow pulled on his heaviest coat, laced snowshoes over his boots, took a long breath that burned the back of his throat. Then he stepped off the porch into snow that reached his waist even after the wind had packed it hard, because the drifts in the yard were twice that deep. He did not tell his wife where he was going. He did not tell his son. The errand he had set for himself was not one a man announces at the breakfast table. He was walking 3 miles west into the low hills beyond the Smoky Hill River to find out whether Willa Greer's children were still alive. He did not expect them to be. The widow had abandoned her cabin in November, dragged her belongings into a hole in the ground, a forgotten dugout in the Flint hillside that she had expanded with nothing but a pick, a shovel, a pair of cracked, bleeding hands. She had built some kind of contraption in the center of it, a monstrous pile of stone that she called a stove, following instructions from a dead man's journal that nobody in Bitter Fork could read. The town had watched her do it with the particular horror that small communities reserve for those who refuse the available solutions. They had called it Greer's Folly. The name had stuck like burrs in wool. Now pushing through the drifts with his lungs burning in the -20 air, Crow rehearsed the scene he was certain he would find. The dugout sealed under snow, the door frozen shut. Inside, the cold that comes when a fire has been dead for days, the kind of cold that does not merely occupy a room but inhabits it, fills it with a silence that is different from any other silence on earth. He had seen frozen death once before, in the winter of 1880, a trapper north of the Solomon River. The man's face had looked peaceful, almost confused, as if death had arrived in the middle of a thought he had not finished thinking. Crow walked 1 mile, 2. The snow squeaked beneath his snowshoes with the sounds of small animals in pain. His beard froze solid. The sun was a pale coin behind clouds so thin they barely counted as clouds at all, just a membrane of gray between the earth below, the nothing above. At the edge of the hills he stopped. He saw the chimney pipe first, a narrow stone tube barely visible above the enormous drift that had consumed the hillside, the dugout, everything. A person who did not know it was there would have walked directly over it without a second glance. But from that narrow pipe, rising into the still, frozen air with the laziness of something utterly unconcerned with the catastrophe that had just passed through this country, was a thread of smoke. Not the thick, panicked black smoke of a stove being driven past its limits. This smoke was pale, nearly transparent, rising in a clean vertical line because there was no wind left to bend it. It was the breathing of something at rest. Crow's legs stopped moving before his mind caught up. He stood knee-deep in a drift, staring at that wisp of smoke, his pulse hammering in his temples. Then he pushed forward, floundering the last 100 yards, dropping to his knees at the snow wall covering the entrance. He dug with his bare hands. The snow came away in hard chunks. His fingers went numb. He did not stop. The door was a simple wooden plank, rough cut, fitted into a frame of heavier timber. He expected ice to have sealed it shut. He expected to have to break it down. The door swung inward at his touch, easy as a gate on a summer afternoon. What hit him was warmth, not the sharp, desperate blast of a fire roaring at full draw, not the dry, scorching bubble that surrounded an iron stove. This was something else entirely. It came from everywhere at once, from the floor, from the walls, from the air itself, a warmth that was not fighting anything, not clinging to its source, not being torn away by draft. It was simply there, steady, present, like stepping from January into a late October afternoon. Inside, a woman sat at a rough wooden table grinding coffee beans with a hand mill. 2 children played on the floor behind her, their cheeks flushed pink, wearing nothing heavier than wool shirts. The air smelled of bread. Crow stood in the doorway with snow melting off his shoulders, ice cracking in his beard, his bare hands burning with cold. He looked at the woman. He looked at the children. He looked at the pile of stone in the center of the room, the thing he had called dangerous foolishness, the thing the entire town had called a grave marker for a family too stubborn to accept help. The stone was radiating heat the way the sun radiates light. Not violently, not desperately, with the unhurried certainty of something that had made a promise hours ago, perhaps the night before, perhaps longer, a promise it fully intended to keep. To his right, in a neat stack against the wall, sat the widow's woodpile, the one he had declared a death sentence, the cottonwood that every man in Bitter Fork had measured with his eyes, calculated against the winter, found catastrophically wanting. It was almost untouched. Denton, 54 years old, master builder, the man who had constructed nearly every sound structure in Bitter Fork, opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. His voice, when it finally arrived, was a sound he had never heard himself make, small, broken, stripped of every authority he had ever carried. One word, a question that was also a surrender. 6 months earlier, in October of 1887, the wind in Kansas had already begun its long assault. Bitter Fork sat in the open country west of the Smoky Hill River, a settlement of 180 souls scattered across the rolling emptiness of the Flint Hills. There were no mountains here, no forests, nothing taller than a cottonwood tree to interrupt the path of whatever the sky decided to send south. The town had a general store run by a man named Whitmore, a small church with walls so thin you could hear the hymns from the hitching post, a lumber mill owned by the Crow family. There was a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall. There were claims radiating outward in every direction, homesteads staked by families who had come west on promises printed in railroad pamphlets, promises of rich soil, a new beginning. The soil was adequate, the winters were liars, the new beginnings were rarely the kind the pamphlets described. Willa Greer's claim sat at the western edge of the settlement's reach, a quarter section of grassland that backed up against the Flint Hills where the prairie broke into low ridges of limestone, stubborn pine. Her husband August had chosen the spot for the way the morning light hit the bluestem grass, turning it copper in September. He had pointed at the hills behind the claim, told her they reminded him of the ridgelines where he had grown up in Pennsylvania, the kind of country that had bones in it. Willa had loved him for seeing beauty in a place other men only measured by its distance from water. She had not yet learned to resent him for it. August Greer died on the 14th of September, 6 weeks before the first frost, taken by typhoid fever that moved through his body with the efficiency of a fire through dry wood. He was 34. The illness lasted 11 days. On the first day he had insisted it was nothing, just the exhaustion of a man who had been splitting fence rails in the August heat. By the 4th day he could not stand. By the 8th he no longer recognized his wife's face. Willa sat beside him through all of it, pressing wet cloths to his forehead, spooning broth between his cracked lips, watching the man she had married dissolve into someone she did not know, a stranger with hollow eyes who muttered in a language that was not English, fragments of a childhood she had never been part of. He died in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, so quietly that Willa did not realize it had happened until she reached for his hand, found it cooling, understood with a physical shock that passed through her body like a current that the stillness in his chest was not sleep. She buried him on the hill behind the cabin in a spot where the morning light hit the bluestem. The Reeves family came, Mr. Whitmore from the store, a few others. Denton Crow stood at the back of the small gathering with his hat in his hands, his face arranged in the expression of formal sympathy that men of his generation wore to funerals the way they wore their Sunday coats, correct, without comfort. After Willa was alone with 2 children, a leaking, an iron stove that consumed wood the way a drunk consumes whiskey, a woodpile that was a lie dressed up as a promise. Jesse was 6. He had his father's dark hair, his father's habit of going quiet when he was thinking, his father's unsettling ability to watch a situation without blinking until he understood it completely. In the weeks after the funeral, Jesse stopped asking when his father was coming back. He did not replace the question with tears or tantrums. He replaced it with vigilance. He watched his mother the way a sentry watches a perimeter, from the edge of the room, with an alertness that no 6-year-old should have needed to learn. When Willa fed the stove, Jesse counted the logs. When she checked the sky, Jesse checked it too. He had become her mirror, reflecting back to her the anxiety she was trying to hide from him, multiplied by the helplessness of a child who understood the danger without understanding the math. Pearl was 4. She had not yet learned to be afraid of things she could not see. The cold was a nuisance to her, something that made her nose run, something that meant more blankets at night. She sat close to the stove because that was where warmth lived, watching the iron door with the focused intensity of a child guarding a pet. When the fire died down, Pearl would look at her mother with an expression that was not fear but expectation, a calm, unshakable certainty that the fire would be fed again, because it always had been. Willa found this trust more terrifying than Jessie's watchfulness. Jessie's worry she could meet with reassurance, however hollow. Pearl's faith she could only betray. The cabin August built was the work of a man who read books about carpentry but had never apprenticed under a carpenter. The design was ambitious, a single room with a sleeping loft, a proper doorframe with hinges he had ordered from a catalog in Topeka, a window of real glass that had survived the wagon journey from Indiana wrapped in 3 layers of quilting. The execution was another matter. The walls were cottonwood logs, poorly seasoned, already beginning to check along the grain in the dry Kansas air. The chinking between them was a mixture of clay, grass, dried mud that had been adequate for the mild winter of 1886 but had since cracked, separated from the logs in dozens of places, leaving gaps that were invisible from outside, but that the wind discovered with unerring precision. The roof was sawed over planks, heavy enough to keep out rain but riddled with channels where mice had burrowed, creating pathways for cold air to descend directly into the living space. The whole structure listed slightly to the east, away from the prevailing wind, as if the cabin itself had already conceded the argument. The iron stove squatted in the center of this failing shelter like a small black god demanding tribute. It was a standard pot-bellied model cast iron, the kind sold by the thousands to homesteaders across the plains. When Willa fed it a log of cottonwood, the soft, fast-burning wood that was all she had, the iron heated quickly, the sides ticking as the metal expanded. The air nearest the stove became ferocious, dry enough to crack skin, hot enough to make a person step back. But the heat was a shout. It rose to the ceiling, hit the sod, spread laterally along the underside of the roof until it found the cracks, the gaps, the mouse channels, the imperfections, then it vanished. Gone, stolen by the wind before it could do the work it was meant to do. Meanwhile, cold air rushed across the floor to replace what the stove had sent upward, creating a draft that chilled ankles, turned the lower half of the room into a different season than the upper half. The stove consumed a log every hour. The water bucket 3 feet from its base still froze overnight. Willa did the math every morning with the grim precision of a woman counting bullets in a siege. 3 cords of cottonwood, each cord containing roughly 128 cubic feet of wood. Cottonwood burning at roughly twice the rate of oak. At the current rate of consumption, she would run out of fuel somewhere in the second week of December. Winter in Kansas did not end until March. Between December and March lay a gap of 10 to 12 weeks with nothing in it but cold. She had not spoken this number aloud. Not to the women at Whitmore's store, who still offered small courtesies, an extra measure of flour, a jar of preserves pressed into her hands with a murmured word. Not to Mr. Whitmore himself, who measured out her purchases with the careful generosity of a man who knew that pity was a debt the pitied could never repay. Not to the Reeves family, who waved from their wagon when they passed on the road, their faces showing the particular expression of people who felt they should be doing more, but could not determine what more looked like in practice. Willa kept the number to herself. It sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed, heavy, indigestible, growing sharper with each passing day. Pity was the first currency Bitter Fork offered her. It came wrapped in casseroles, in offers to watch the children, in the way Mrs. Morton at the church touched her elbow after Sunday service with a tenderness that was genuine but temporary. Willa recognized the pattern from Indiana, from watching other widows navigate the choreography of communal sympathy. Pity lasted about 2 months after a funeral. It was a blanket that kept a woman warm just long enough for the community to convince itself that the crisis had passed, that the widow was managing, that further intervention was unnecessary. After 2 months, pity began to curdle. It thickened into something more practical, appraisal. The community started measuring the widow against its needs, its values, its definitions of what a woman alone could reasonably be expected to accomplish. If the widow met those expectations, pity aged into respect. If she did not, it soured into judgment. A widow with 2 small children on a failing claim at the edge of a settlement was not an asset. She was a problem waiting for its season. Denton Crow arrived at her cabin on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, precisely 2 months after August's funeral, as if his appearance had been scheduled by the same internal calendar that governed the expiration of communal sympathy. He came, his hat in his large calloused hands before he even reached the door, a gesture of respect that Willa recognized immediately as a prelude to something she would not want to hear. Crow was 54 years old. He had built the lumber mill from nothing, turning raw timber from the hills into the boards, beams, joists that held Bitter Fork together. His own house was the finest structure in the region for 30 miles in any direction. Oak frame, clapboard siding milled to his specifications, chinking so tight a knife blade could not find purchase between the logs. His stove was the largest in the settlement, a massive cast-iron beast that his wife kept fed with seasoned oak from their seemingly inexhaustible woodshed. When Denton Crow spoke about building, about the engineering of survival on the plains, men listened the way they listened to a preacher, not because they chose to believe, but because the alternative was unthinkable. He walked the perimeter of Willa's cabin with the slow, deliberate gait of a man inspecting a structure he already knew was condemned. He pressed his thumb into the chinking at 3 separate points along the south wall, watching the clay crumble under minimal pressure. He looked up at the roofline, noted the eastward lean, the way the ridge beam had begun to bow under the weight of the sod. He knelt at the foundation, scraped at the lowest log with his thumbnail, frowned at the softness he found there. Willa stood in the doorway watching him, Jessie pressed against her leg, Pearl behind them both, peering out between the doorframe with the frank curiosity of a child who did not yet understand that some visitors brought bad news simply by the way they moved through the world. Crow returned to the front of the cabin. His face held no malice. What it held was worse, the impersonal certainty of a man delivering a verdict he had reached before he arrived. He looked at the woodpile against the east wall. "You need 18 cords of good oak to see this winter through, Willa, maybe more. 18 cords. The number landed in the space between them like something heavy dropped from a height. Willa's woodpile was 3 cords of cottonwood. The distance between 3 cords of cottonwood, 18 cords of oak, was not a gap. It was a canyon. She could not fell that much timber alone, could not buck it, could not split it. She did not have the physical strength, the time, the tools. August's axe was dull, the saw was rusted. She had no horse to drag logs from the hills, no wagon to haul them. Even if she worked every daylight hour from now until the first snow, she could not close the distance between what she had, what she needed. Crow knew this. The number was not advice, it was a diagnosis. He stood there for a moment, holding his hat, looking at the cabin with an expression that was closer to a coroner's assessment than a builder's critique. Then he added something that Willa would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was cruel, but because it was delivered with the same neutral practicality as the number. "Spring, when the snow melts, you should think about the longer view. There are good men in this town. Stable men. The children need a father." He put his hat back on, nodded once, mounted his horse, rode east toward town without looking back. Willa stood in the doorway until his shape dissolved into the distance. Jessie's hand gripped her skirt. Pearl had already gone back inside to watch the stove. Crow's words sat in her stomach beside the stone she had already swallowed. She understood what he was saying. A widow without resources on the Kansas frontier was not a permanent category. It was a temporary condition that resolved itself in one of 2 ways, remarriage or departure. If Willa could not survive the winter on her own terms, spring would bring men to her door with practical proposals dressed in polite language, offers of partnership that were really offers of absorption. She would cease to be Willa Greer. She would become someone's second wife, her children folded into another man's household, her claim signed over, her identity compressed into a supporting role in someone else's story. This was not malice. This was the machinery of prairie survival, gears that turned with or without anyone's consent. For the first time since August's death, Willa felt afraid of something besides the cold. She was afraid of spring. That, after Jessie's breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, after Pearl curled against her brother on the narrow bed in the loft, her thumb in her mouth, her free hand clutching the ear of a stuffed rabbit that August had sewn from scraps, Willa sat alone at the small table near the stove. The fire was dying. She did not feed it. She was conserving. Every log she burned tonight was a log she would not have in December, when December came with its teeth bared. She needed to find something she could sell. A tool, a piece of equipment, anything August had left behind that might convert into cash or credit at Whitmore's store. She went to the trunk against the wall, the large cedar chest August had brought from Pennsylvania, one of the few possessions he had refused to leave behind. Inside she found what she expected: folded shirts, a pair of wool trousers worn thin at the knees, a set of drafting compasses he had used for his endless diagrams, a small Bible with a cracked spine, tin of buttons. Under the clothing, under a layer of muslin that smelled like cedar shavings, August piped back. Her fingers found leather. She pulled it out. A journal bound in dark brown hide, the edges worn soft with handling. The cover bore no title, no name. She opened it, tilting the pages toward the weak light of the tallow lamp. The handwriting inside was dense, meticulous, filling every page from margin to margin. Much of it was in a language Willa could not read, a tight, spidery script that she recognized vaguely as German from the shape of certain letters, the compound words that ran together like trains. But the text was secondary to the drawings. Page after page of intricate diagrams, cross-section, elevation, cutaway views of structures that looked like nothing she had ever seen. A massive rectangular form built from what appeared to be stone, with a complex internal system of channels snaking through its body in an S-shaped path, arrows indicating airflow, numbers indicating measurements. Small notations in the same foreign hand clustered around key junctions like annotations on a map. These were not August's drawings. The hand was older, more precise, trained by decades of technical work. These belonged to August's father. August had spoken of Heinrich Greer the way some men speak of legends, with a mixture of reverence, distance, incomplete. Heinrich had come to America as a young man, a trained miner who had learned his trade in the tunnels of the old country before crossing the Atlantic to work the coal fields of Appalachian Pennsylvania. He was not a man who built on the surface of the earth, he was a man who built inside it. He understood stone, pressure, the behavior of heat in enclosed spaces. He had spent 15 years in the Pennsylvania mines before his lungs forced him above ground. But he carried the knowledge of those years the way a priest carries scripture, as a foundation that everything else was built upon. August told Willa once in the early months of their marriage that his father had built their family home not on the hillside but into it. A dugout, he called it, but not the crude soddy that homesteaders threw together on the plains. Heinrich's home was engineered, walls of packed earth reinforced with stone, a ceiling of heavy timber under 3 feet of sod, ventilation channels cut with the precision of mine shafts. In the center of that underground room, Heinrich had built what he called a catchlofen, a masonry heat, a stove made not of iron but of stone brick, fired, a stove that did not scream with heat for an hour then go cold the way iron stoves did, a stove that absorbed heat into its massive body slowly, then released it for 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours after the fire itself had died. August had grown up in the warmth of that stone. He told Willa that winter in Pennsylvania in his father's house was not a siege, it was a season like any other. The stone kept its promise regardless of what the sky was doing. When August moved west to Kansas with Willa, he brought the journal. He talked about building a catchalofen of their own someday, when there was time, when the cabin was finished, when the well was dug, when the fencing was done. There was always one more task standing between the present moment, the someday that never arrived. Heinrich's journal stayed in the bottom of the trunk, under the shirts, under the muslin, waiting. Willa turned the pages slowly. The foreign text meant nothing to her. But August had been here too. His handwriting appeared in the margins, in English, translating key phrases, adding notes of his own. She recognized his script immediately. The slanted letters, the way he pressed too hard on downstrokes, the small flourish on his capital letters that she used to tease him about. Seeing his handwriting now was like hearing his voice from another room, close enough to recognize, too far to touch. Thermal mass, one note read. The stone remembers heat. Another, beside a diagram of the S-shaped flue channel, do not heat the air. Heat the stone, let the stone heat the people. A third, written in larger letters across the bottom of a particularly complex drawing, underlined twice, make the heat pay rent before it leaves. Willa studied the diagrams with the slow attention of a woman who has no training in engineering, but possesses the practical intelligence of someone who has spent her life figuring things out by looking at them long enough. The catchalofen was not complicated in concept, even if the execution was precise. A firebox at the base where a small hot fire burned for 1 to 2 hours. Above the firebox, instead of a straight chimney that would carry the hot gases directly out of the structure, wasting most of the heat, the gases were directed into a long serpentine channel that wound back again through the massive body of the stove. Stone walls surrounded the channel on every side. The hot gases pressed against those walls at every turn, surrendering their heat into the stone through direct contact. By the time the gases finally reached the chimney exit at the top, they had given up nearly everything. Now warm would radiate that stored heat outward for hours, not as hot air that could be stolen by drafts, but as infrared warmth, the same kind of warmth a person feels from sunlight that heated objects, floors, walls, bodies, rather than the air itself. She read August's notes again. The stone remembers heat, make the heat pay rent. The stove in her cabin, the iron god that consumed a log every hour while the water bucket froze 3 feet from its base, was the opposite of this. Iron heated fast, lost heat fast. Stone heated slow, held heat slow. Iron was a shout. Stone was a story told through the night. Willa turned to the last page of the journal. The final entry was not a diagram. It was, in English, in August handwriting, undated. The ink was darker than the margin notes, as if he had pressed the pen harder, as if the words mattered more than annotations, as if he had written them not for reference but for someone specific. If you read this page without me, trust the stone. She stared at the sentence. Read it again, a third time. August had known, not that he would die of typhoid on a September morning. No man knows the specific shape of his own death. But he had known the general truth that the prairie taught every family eventually that one of them might not make it. He had prepared for that possibility the only way he knew how, not by building the cachelophan while he was alive, because there was never time, but by making sure the instructions survived him. He had translated the key passages. He had written his final note in English, not in his father's language. He had placed the journal at the bottom of the trunk under his shirts, where the person who unpacked his life after he was gone would eventually find it. He had left her a map to a country she did not yet know existed. He just never told her it was there. Willa sat at the table with the journal open to its last page, the tallow lamp guttering, the stove ticking as its iron cooled, Jessie's breathing slow above her in the loft. She did not cry. She had spent herself on crying. What she felt was something harder, a pressure behind her breastbone that was not grief but recognition, the particular ache of understanding something too late, too perfect. She read the sentence one more time, "Trust the stone." Then the lamp went out, the wick burned to nothing, leaving her in darkness with the wind outside, the cooling iron beside her, the dead man's words in her lap. The following morning, Willa left Jessie with instructions to feed the stove sparingly, too small, not while she went out. She bundled Pearl in every layer they owned, set the girl beside her brother near the stove with the stuffed rabbit, a cup of warm water, a stern look that communicated more than words could. Then she took August's axe, the small handcart, walked west. She was not going to the creek bed for cottonwood. The creek bed had given everything it had. She was going further, into the Flint Hills beyond the river, where the terrain broke into ridges of exposed limestone, where scrub cedar grew in the cracks between rocks, where twisted pines clung to slopes too steep for grass. The wood there was poor, sappy, hard to split, full of knots that turned the axe blade, but it was something. It was an act of motion against the paralysis that Denton Crow's visit had left in her. The walk took an hour. The hills were not high, 50, 60 feet above the surrounding prairie, but they were exposed, the wind hitting them without obstruction from any direction. Willa spent the day among the cedar, the scrub pine, gathering fallen branches, hauling deadwood, her hands bleeding from the sharp bark, her shoulders burning from the weight of the axe. The sun was a pale disk in a sky the color of old linen. It gave light without warmth, illumination without comfort. By mid-afternoon her cart held perhaps enough wood for 2 days of careful burning. She had spent 8 hours of labor, a full day's worth of calories, to gain 48 hours of fuel. The arithmetic was impossible. She was a woman bailing the ocean with a cup. As the light began to fail, Willa started back along the ridge that overlooked the river valley. She walked close to the edge, using the ridge as a windbreak, her body angled against the gusts that tried to push her sideways. The dry grass was tall here, knee-high, bleached to a pale gold that caught the last of the light. It obscured the ground beneath it, the roots, the rock, the uneven terrain that the ridge concealed under its carpet of blue stem. Her left foot came down on what felt like solid ground. It was not. Beneath the grass, a groove in the limestone, a natural channel where water ran during spring rains, caught her boot at the ankle, twisted it sideways. She stumbled, overcorrected, lost her balance. Her right foot found nothing but air. The ridge edge, hidden by the grass, dropped away beneath her into a short, steep embankment, a talus slope of loose rock, dry soil, the accumulated debris of a hillside slowly eroding. She fell. Not far, perhaps 8 feet, but fast enough that the impact knocked the breath from her body, sent the axe spinning out of her hand, left her lying face down in a pile of loose shale at the base of the slope. The handcart stayed on top, balanced at the edge, one wheel spinning slowly in the wind. Willa lay still. She tested her limbs, arms, legs, fingers. Nothing broken. She rolled onto her back, looked up at the ridge above her, waited for her breathing to slow. The sky was beginning to darken. She needed to get up. She needed to retrieve the cart. She needed to get home before full dark, before Jessie started to worry, before Pearl started to cry. She pushed herself to sitting, turned to find the axe. Instead, she found the entrance. It was behind a dense thicket of wild plum bushes, their thorny branches interlocking into a natural barrier that would have stopped any casual approach from the ridge above. From Willa's position at the base of the slope, sprawled in the shale where the fall had deposited her, she was looking at the thicket from below, from an angle that revealed what the bushes concealed from every other direction. A shadow. Not the shadow cast by rock or tree, a deeper shadow, a darkness that had depth to it, that receded into the hillside rather than lying flat against it. A darkness that was a space. She crawled forward, pushed aside the plum branches, the thorns catching her sleeves, scratching her wrists, peered into the gap. The air that flowed out from the shadow was still, cold, but a cold she had never encountered. not the biting, aggressive cold of the Kansas wind, the cold that sought out bare skin, that pushed through clothing, that came at a person with intent. This was neutral cold, earth cold, the temperature of the ground itself, steady, patient, indifferent. It did not attack, it simply existed. 52, 53 degrees, the temperature that the earth maintains a few feet below its surface regardless of what the season above is doing. Willa felt it on her face the way she might feel a hand placed calmly against her cheek, not hot, simply present. She stepped inside. It was a dugout. Man-made, clearly, perhaps longer. The walls were packed earth reinforced with flat stones laid in rough courses. The ceiling was a lattice of heavy timber, logs so old they had petrified, hardened into something closer to stone than wood, covered by a layer of sod so thick that roots from the prairie above dangled through in places, pale tendrils reaching into darkness. The space extended roughly 15 feet into the hillside before ending in a rockfall, a collapse of earth, smaller timbers that had sealed the rear portion at some unknown point in the past. Willa stood in the center of the dugout, her hand against the wall. The earth was cool under her palm, not cold. Cool the way a cellar is cool in summer, consistent, the temperature of the planet itself, unmoved by the hysteria of the atmosphere above. The wind could not be heard here. That was the detail that stopped her, held her still, made her press both hands flat against the wall as if confirming that what she was feeling was real. For 6 weeks, the wind had been the constant companion of her grief, howling at her cabin walls, whistling through the gaps August had left, moaning in the stovepipe, a voice that never stopped reminding her of every flaw in the shelter her dead husband had built. Here, 3 feet of earth above her head, the wind was gone, not muffled, not reduced, gone. The silence was so complete it had texture, weight, presence. It was the silence of being held. Then, standing in that silence with the earth's neutral cold on her skin, something happened in Willa's mind that she would later describe not as a thought but as a seeing, a sudden overlay of image on reality, as if someone had placed a transparent drawing over the scene before her. The diagrams from August's journal, the cross-sections, the S-shaped flute, the massive stone body of the cachalophin, superimposed themselves on the dimensions of this space. The firebox would go here, against the east wall where the rockfall currently sat. The chimney channel would exit there, through the natural fissure in the limestone above. The sleeping platform would run along the west wall, raised off the floor to catch the radiant heat. The cachalophin itself would stand in the center, exactly where she was standing now, a 2-ton heart of stone in a body of earth. She was not looking at a ruin. She was not looking at a forgotten hole in the ground. She was looking at a home that had not been built yet. In 60 seconds, standing in the quiet of a dugout that no one in Bitter Fork knew existed, Willa Greer saw the rest of her winter. Not as a sentence to be endured, not as a problem to be solved by remarriage or departure or the slow arithmetic of an inadequate woodpile. She saw it as a space she could build, a truth she could construct with her own hands from the instructions a dead man had left her, using knowledge passed from his father before him. She did not smile. The situation did not call for smiling. What she felt was closer to the sensation of finding a foothold on a cliff face, not safety, but the cessation of falling. A place to put weight, a reason to reach for the next hold. She memorized the dimensions of the dugout, the width of the entrance, the height of the ceiling, the depth of the rockfall. Then she crawled back through the plum thicket, climbed the talus slope, retrieved her cart, her axe. She walked home in the dark, the cold wind hitting her face like an old adversary that did not yet know it had lost something important. The children were awake when she arrived. Jessie had fed the stove exactly as instructed, 2 pieces, not 3. The cabin was cold. Pearl's nose was running. The water bucket had a film of ice across its surface. Willa fed the stove, made a thin soup from the last of the salt pork, a handful of dried beans, put the children to bed. Jessie watched her from the loft with his unblinking eyes. "Mama, where did you go? Into the hills. Did you find wood?" She looked at him. Her son, 6 years old, already keeping count. "I found something better." He waited for her to explain. She did not. He turned over, pulled the quilt to his chin, closed his eyes. He had learned in 6 weeks of fatherless living that his mother would tell him things when she was ready. Not before. Willa waited until both children were breathing steadily. Then she took the journal from the table where she had left it the night before, opened it to the first diagram, set the tallow lamp beside it. She studied the plans, not as she had the night before, with the desperate curiosity of a woman searching for hope. Now she studied them with the focused practicality of a woman planning a construction project. She identified the materials she would need: flat stone for the firebox lining, round stone for the clay for mortar, sand for tempering. The flat stone existed in abundance on the ridge where she had fallen. The clay was in the creek bed under the cottonwood stumps. Sand was everywhere. The rockfall at the rear of the dugout was itself a source of building stone. The collapse had delivered raw material directly to the construction site, as if the earth were offering to contribute. Through the grimy window, the woodpile stood against the east wall of the cabin. 3 cords of cottonwood, a lie shaped like a promise, enough to kill them slowly by degrees by the arithmetic of diminishing returns. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the journal. Then she looked at the loft, where Jesse slept with his arm around Pearl, their breath rising in small clouds that caught the lamplight before dissolving visible proof, that the air in this cabin was cold enough to condense human breathing, despite the stove having been fed less than an hour ago. Iron shouts. The wind steals the words. What if there was something that did not shout, something that spoke quietly, steadily through the night? Something that remembered? Willa closed the journal, set her hand flat on its leather cover, felt the weight of it, the weight of 2 generations of knowledge, written down, left behind for precisely this moment. August's last gift, Heinrich's life work, a map to a country she did not yet know how to build, but that she had now seen with her own eyes. She blew out the lamp, lay down in the dark, listened to the wind trying to get in through every crack her dead husband had failed to seal. In the morning, Willa Greer rose before the sun. She dressed in the dark, moving by the memory of where things were, boots by the door, coat on the hook, gloves on the shelf. She did not reach for the axe that stood beside the door, the axe she had carried every morning for 6 weeks, the axe that was the only tool Bitter Fork recognized as an appropriate response to winter. She reached past it. She picked up the shovel. She picked up the pick. She left a larger stack of wood than usual for Jesse, set the fire, kissed Pearl's forehead without waking her. Then she walked out into the October dawn, into the dry, the pale light, the wind that did not yet know what she was about to do. She walked west, toward the hills, toward the hole in the earth that no one else could see. The first morning, Willa accomplished almost nothing. She had imagined, during the walk from the cabin to the dugout, that the work would begin with the rockfall, clearing the collapsed stone from the rear of the shelter, extending the usable space from 15 feet to something closer to 25. She had imagined herself prying stones loose, rolling them aside, making progress with the steady efficiency of a woman who understood physical labor. What she discovered instead was that the rockfall was not a pile of loose debris but a compacted mass of stone earth, root system, decades of accumulated pressure that had fused the collapse into something closer to concrete than rubble. Her pick bounced off the surface, her shovel scraped uselessly at the edges. She spent 3 hours extracting a single stone the size of a bread loaf, her arms trembling with the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the earthen walls. By noon she had cleared perhaps 18 inches of depth from the collapse. The dugout had grown by a volume roughly equivalent to a large suitcase. Her hands were bleeding in 2 places. The pick handle had raised a blister on her right palm that burst before she noticed it, leaving a raw patch of skin that would make gripping anything painful for the next week. She sat on the floor of the dugout, her back against the cool earth wall, eating a piece of cold cornbread she had brought wrapped in cloth. The silence surrounded her. Above, the wind was doing its relentless work on the prairie. Down here, 3 feet below the surface, she could not hear it. She ate the cornbread, looked at the rockfall, looked at her hands, did the arithmetic. At 18 inches per day, working alone, it would take her 2 weeks to clear the collapse. After the real construction would begin, laying the foundation of the cachalafin, building its body stone by stone, constructing the serpentine flue channel that was the heart of the entire system. The journal's diagrams showed a structure that weighed roughly 2 tons when completed. 2 tons of mortared with clay, assembled with a precision that left no gaps, no weak points, no passages where hot gases could escape the channel before surrendering their heat. She was one woman with a pick, a shovel, a pair of bleeding hands. The mathematics of the thing were brutal. She went back to work. Jesse helped. Not because she asked. She had not asked. Had in fact told him to stay near the cabin with Pearl, but because he followed her on the 3rd morning, appearing at the dugout entrance with his sister in tow, Pearl clutching the stuffed rabbit in one hand, a tin cup in the other. Jesse looked at the rockfall, at his mother's torn hands, at the pitiful amount of progress visible against the back wall. He did not ask questions. He picked up a stone the size of his fist, carried it to the entrance, set it out, came back for another. He was 6 years old. The stones he could carry weighed perhaps 2 or 3 pounds each. His contribution, measured in cubic feet of debris removed, was negligible, but it was not nothing. Each stone he moved was a stone Willa did not have to bend down for, a small economy of effort that accumulated over the hours. Pearl, meanwhile, discovered the creek bed. The discovery was accidental, the way most 4-year-old discoveries are. Pearl wandered downstream while Jesse worked, following the water's edge with the aimless curiosity of a child exploring. She squatted in the shallows near a bend where the current had undercut the bank, digging in the exposed soil with a stick. When Willa went to retrieve her, she found Pearl sitting in mud up to her elbows, her face radiant with the particular delight of a child who has found something wonderful without understanding what it is. The mud was clay, rich, the color of dark honey, the kind of clay that potters searched for, the kind of clay that, mixed with sand in the right proportions, made mortar strong enough to hold stone against stone for decades. The creek had done the excavation work. The clay deposit ran for 30 feet along the undercut bank, exposed by water, ready for the taking. Willa knelt beside her daughter, pushed her fingers into the clay, squeezed. It held its shape. It did not crumble, did not crack. When she rolled it between her palms, it formed a smooth rope that bent without breaking. She knew enough from watching August mix chinking compound to recognize quality when she held it. Pearl looked up at her mother's face, saw something there she did not understand, an expression that was not a smile but something close to it, something that had not appeared on that face in weeks. "Good mud, Mama. Good mud, Pearl." The clay was the first thing that went right. On the 5th day, a man appeared at the dugout entrance. Willa heard him before she saw him, careful tread on the slope above, the sound of someone descending the talus with the deliberate footwork of a person who did not trust his own balance. She gripped the pick, turned toward the entrance, ready for one of his men, ready for whatever the town had decided to send. The man who ducked through the opening was not Crow. He was shorter, thinner, older, though the years sat on him unevenly, adding weight to his face while subtracting it from his body. His shoulders were narrow inside a coat that had been made for a broader man, perhaps himself at an earlier age. His hands were large for his frame, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that had spent years holding tools in tight spaces. He moved with the careful economy of someone managing a body that no longer cooperated with his intentions. His breathing was audible from 10 feet away, labored, each inhale producing a faint whistle that suggested his lungs were working at a fraction of their capacity. Willa knew him by sight, barely. He lived at the edge of Bitter Fork in a one-room cabin that leaned worse than hers, a solitary man whose presence at the general store was infrequent, whose conversations with the townspeople were limited to the exchange of goods for currency. He had arrived in Kansas from somewhere east, Pennsylvania, she had heard, though the details were vague. A miner, someone had mentioned once, retired, alone, the sort of man small towns absorb without integrating, a presence tolerated but not included. He stood inside the entrance of the dugout, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He looked at the rockfall, at the sorted piles of stone along the walls, at the foundation Willa had begun to lay, the first course of the largest stones she could move, arranged in a rough square at the center of the cleared space. Then his gaze found the journal open on a flat rock near the work area, its pages held down by a smaller stone to keep the wind from turning them. He crossed to the journal. Willa watched him, the pick still in her hands. He did not ask permission. He leaned over the open pages, studying the diagrams with the focused attention of a man reading something in a language he already spoke. His scarred fingers traced the outline of the serpentine flue channel, followed the arrows indicating gas flow, stopped at a notation in the margin. For a full minute he did not speak. Then he straightened, turned to look at the foundation stones, looked back at the journal, looked at Willa. "Heinrich Greer, your husband's father?" Willa's grip on the pick tightened. She had not told anyone about the journal, had not mentioned the plans, the catch elephant, any of it. She had worked in silence, hoping the town would ignore her long enough for the work to be done. "You knew him?" "No." Pruitt touched the edge of the journal page with one finger lightly, the way a person touches something fragile. "But I know this stove. I heated with one for 12 years in Pennsylvania." The words landed in the dugout silence with the weight of something Willa had not dared to hope for. In 6 weeks of studying the journal, 6 weeks of translating August's margin notes into physical action, of guessing at measurements, of trying to understand through drawings what she had never seen built, she had been working entirely on faith. Faith in August's notes, faith in Heinrich's engineering, faith in the principle that stone could do what iron could not. But faith was not knowledge. Faith was the space between believing something would work, knowing it would. "You lived through winters with one of these?" 12 of them, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Pruitt's breathing rattled, a thin sound like wind through a cracked pane. "Never cold. One fire in the evening, stone warm at dawn. One fire in the evening, stone warm at dawn." Willa set the pick down, she said, turning to the journal, pointing at the diagram that had given her the most trouble. "The S-curve, I understand the principle. Hot gases travel through the channel, heat transfers into the stone, but the angles here, at the second turn, The drawing shows a 45-degree redirect. If I build that wrong, if the angle is too sharp, the gases won't flow, they'll stall, the smoke will back up into the room. Pruitt was already shaking his head, not in disagreement, but in the corrective reflex of a man who had spent years watching other people misread technical drawings. The angle isn't 45, look again. He bent over the journal, his labored breath fogging the page. That's a perspective mark, not a construction line. The actual turn is closer to 30 degrees, gentler. The gas has to want to keep moving, you're guiding it, not forcing it. Force it, you create turbulence. Turbulence means uneven heating, dead spots in the mass where the stone never reaches temperature. He looked up, his eyes set deep in a face carved by years of underground work, held an intensity that his frail body contradicted. This was a man whose mind was still operating at full capacity inside a shell that was shutting down around it. You're building the foundation too narrow. Willa looked at the square of stone she had laid. 4 feet by 4 feet, the dimensions she had estimated from the journal's diagrams. It needs to be 5 by 5, minimum. Pruitt lowered himself to a crouch beside the foundation, wincing at whatever the movement cost his lungs. The mass is everything, more mass, more storage. More storage, longer release. You want this stone telling its story at dawn, you need enough of it to remember the whole night. He was right. Willa could see it the moment he said it. The proportions in the diagram were not to the scale she had assumed. The firebox needed a wider base, the flue channels needed more stone surrounding them. The entire structure needed to be larger than she had planned, heavier, more massive, which meant more stone, more clay, more labor. She looked at her hands, looked at the pick. Pruitt was already moving stones, not the large ones, his body no longer had the strength for that. But he rearranged the foundation course with a precision that showed 30 years of working with rock in confined spaces. Each stone was tested, set down, tested again. He built the way a watchmaker builds, by feel, by an understanding of how pressure distributes through rigid materials that went deeper than any diagram. They worked through the afternoon without speaking much. The economy of their communication was physical. Pruitt pointed. Willa moved. He indicated where the next stone should go. She hauled it into position. Jessie, watching from the entrance, began sorting the smaller stones into piles by shape, flat ones, round ones there, without being asked. Pearl fell asleep on a blanket near the doorway, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. By evening, the foundation had been relaid, wider, stronger. The first course of the cachalophan's body, the ring of stones that would form the outer wall of the firebox, was in place. Pruitt examined it in the fading light, running his hand along the top edge, testing the level with a practiced eye. Tomorrow, the firebox lining, flattest stones you have. Smooth faces inward. The fire will hit these surfaces first. They need to be dense, no cracks. Cracked stone explodes under heat. Then he climbed the slope slowly. Each step an effort that cost him breath he did not have to spare, disappeared over the ridge toward town. Pruitt returned the next morning, the morning after that. Every morning for the next 2 weeks. He did not explain his presence. He did not ask for compensation, offer commentary on Willa's situation, volunteer opinions about the town's judgment. He arrived at dawn, worked until his lungs forced him to stop, sat against the wall breathing shallowly while Willa continued, resumed when his body permitted. The division of labor was natural, unspoken. Willa did the heavy work, the hauling, the lift, the brutal labor of moving hundreds of pounds of stone each day. Pruitt did the precision work, the fitting, the angling, the calculations that turned raw stone into engineered structure. Jessie continued his sorting. Pearl continued her excavation of the creek bank, delivering buckets of clay to the dugout entrance with the solemn pride of a child contributing to something she could not name but understood to be important. The cachalophan grew. Day by day, course by course, the body of it rose from the foundation like something being born from the earth rather than built upon it. The firebox took shape first, a chamber roughly 2 feet square, lined with the densest, smoothest stone Willa could find, its walls thick enough to contain the heat of a small but intense fire without cracking. Above the firebox, the first channel of the serpentine flue began its journey, a horizontal passage, 8 inches wide, running to the east wall of the stove before making its first 30-degree turn. The turn was critical. Pruitt supervised it with the intensity of a surgeon, rejecting 3 stones before finding one whose natural angle matched the curve he needed. The channel continued west, turned again, ran east, turned again, each passage stacked above the last, each turn forcing the hot gases against fresh stone, each stone absorbing heat it would later release. The mortar was Pearl's clay mixed with sand from the creek bed, kneaded by Willa's bare feet in a shallow pit she had dug near the entrance. She mixed it in the evenings, after the day's stonework was done, walking back forth through the cold mud until it reached the consistency Pruitt demanded, smooth enough to spread with a trowel. dense enough to hold shape under compression, wet enough to bond with the stone but not so wet that it would crack as it dried. Her feet ached. Her calves burned. The clay worked its way under her toenails into the cracks of her skin, staining her lower legs a reddish brown that no amount of washing could remove. Das Eisenschreit, Pruitt muttered one afternoon, fitting a capstone over the second flue channel. The words were German. Willa looked at him. He caught her expression, translated with the ghost of a smile. Iron shouts. Something your husband's father used to write. He tapped the capstone with his knuckle. Listen to the sound it made, a low, resonant tone, like a bell struck underwater. Stone speaks quietly, but it speaks all night. Willa filed the phrase away. Iron shouts. Stone speaks. It was the kind of sentence that could carry a person through a long winter if she let it. The practical education happened in fragments, embedded in the work rather than delivered as lectures. Pruitt taught the way men who have worked with their hands for decades teach, through correction, demonstration, the occasional grunt of approval that communicated more than a paragraph of praise. When Willa asked why the dugout felt warmer than her cabin even without a fire, Pruitt picked up a handful of earth from the floor, held it in his open palm. What temperature is this dirt? Cold. No, this dirt is 52 degrees, same as the dirt 5 feet down, same as the dirt 50 feet down. The earth holds its temperature like a miser holds gold. It does not let go. He closed his fist around the soil. Your cabin sits on top of the ground. It fights the air. On a bad night, the air outside is -20, -30. Your stove has to push the temperature inside up 100 degrees just to keep water from freezing. That is a war you cannot win with cottonwood. He opened his hand, let the dirt fall. This dugout sits inside the ground. The ground is already 52 degrees. You only need to add 15, 20 degrees more. The earth is doing most of the work. You are finishing what the planet started. On another day, while they waited for a course of mortar to set before adding the next layer, Pruitt explained how the iron stove actively worked against itself without ever mentioning Crow's name. He picked up a flat stone, held it in one palm. This stone does not care about air. When it absorbs heat, it does not send it to the ceiling. It radiates. Infrared, the same warmth you feel from sunlight. It goes outward in every direction, into the floor, the furniture, the people. It cannot be pumped out. It cannot be stolen by drafts. The wind can scream all night. The stone does not hear it. There was a rhythm to those days that Willa would remember for the rest of her life. Not the rhythm of grief, which was arrhythmic by nature, striking without pattern, subsiding without reason. This was the rhythm of construction. Each morning brought a specific task. Each task, when completed, made visible progress. The cachalofin grew taller. The flue channels multiplied. The body thickened. What had been a foundation became a structure. What had been a pile of sorted stones became walls, channels, surfaces designed to absorb, store, release. Willa's hand, which had been raw in the first week, developed new calluses, harder, thicker than the ones she had carried from Indiana, the calluses of a mason rather than a farm wife. Her shoulders broadened, her grip strengthened. She could carry stones now that would have defeated her a month earlier. The cost was visible in other ways. She grew thinner. The food she was eating, salt pork that was running low, the occasional rabbit Jessie snared near the creek, was not enough to fuel the labor she was demanding of her body. Her face lost its fullness, the bones of her wrists became prominent, her dresses hung loose. But her eyes, which had been flat with grief in September, now held something else, a focused intensity that the people of Bitter Fork, when they saw her on her increasingly rare visits to Whitmore's store, did not recognize as determination. They recognized it as madness. The community's judgment arrived in stages, each one harder than the last. First, the whispers. Willa heard them at Whitmore's store during her weekly trip for supplies, conversations that stopped when she entered, resumed in lower voices when she moved to a different aisle. Gone simple with grief. Building something in the hills, Lord knows what. The children? Has anyone checked on those children? The whispers were not hostile. Not yet. They were concerned, in the way that communities are concerned about members who have stopped behaving predictably. Predictability was the currency of small-town survival. A widow who chopped wood was predictable. A widow who dug holes was not. Second, the delegation. Mrs. Crow appeared at Willa's cabin on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, wearing her best bonnet, carrying a jar of apple butter that served as both gift, admission ticket. She was Denton Crow's wife, a thin, careful woman whose social position in Bitter Fork was defined entirely by her husband's authority. She was not unkind. She was in her own constrained way genuinely worried. She had heard the stories. She wanted to see for herself. Willa was not at the cabin. She was at the dugout working. Mrs. Crow found the cabin empty, the stove cold, the children absent. She waited an hour. When Willa returned at dusk, Mudcake exhausted, Jessie trailing behind with a bucket of clay, Pearl asleep on Willa's hip. Mrs. Crow studied the scene with the particular attention of a woman compiling a report. The conversation was brief. Mrs. Crow asked polite questions. Willa gave minimal answers. The children were healthy, yes. They were eating, yes. The work in the hills chose her work. A shelter. A winter shelter, an improvement on the cabin. Mrs. Crow looked at Willa's hands, raw, stained dark with clay, the nails broken short. She looked at Jessie's knees, brown with dried mud. She looked at Pearl's sleeping face, peaceful but thin. The town worries about you, Willa. The town can stop. Mrs. Crow left with the apple butter untouched on the table. She went home, removed her bonnet, sat across from her husband at the dinner table. The children look healthy enough, Denton. But the cabin is cold. She's not keeping the fire. She spends all day at some hole in the hills, building something out of rocks. Rocks, Denton. She's got old Pruitt helping her, the one with the bad lungs. If the roof of that hole collapses, if smoke fills the space, if those children are inside when something goes wrong, who answers for that? Crow set his fork down. The question was not rhetorical. In Bitter Fork, as in every small settlement on the frontier, the line between a family's private business, the community's responsibility was drawn by consensus. A woman making unusual choices was tolerable. A woman making unusual choices with children in her care was a different calculation. If those children came to harm, the community would hold itself accountable for having seen the warning signs but failed to act. The pressure to intervene was not cruelty. It was the mathematics of collective guilt. Crow pushed his plate aside, reached for his coat. He found the dugout the next morning by following the thin trail of smoke from Pruitt's workfire, a small blaze at the entrance that Pruitt used to warm his hands between bouts of labor. Crow descended the talus slope with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who had already decided what he would find. He ducked through the entrance, straightened to his full height inside the expanded space, let his eyes adjust. The dugout had changed since he had last heard it described. It was larger, 25 feet deep now, the rock fall cleared, the rear wall exposing solid limestone. The ceiling was intact, the sod layer undisturbed. Along both walls, sorted piles of stone stood in neat rows, organized by shape density. Buckets of mixed mortar lined the east wall. The air was cool, carrying the particular smell of disturbed earth that Crow associated with cellars, graves. In the center of the room stood the calaphon. It was not finished. The upper courses were still incomplete, the chimney channel not yet connected to the exit pipe, but the body was unmistakable. A massive rectangular structure, 4 feet wide, 5 feet, rising to a height of roughly 4 feet. Stone upon stone upon stone, mortared with clay, the surfaces rough but the joints tight. The firebox, an iron plate Willa had salvaged from the ruined stove of an abandoned homestead 5 miles east, was set into the lower face, but solid. The first 2 channels of the serpentine flue were complete, their openings visible at the turns where the capstones had not yet been laid. It looked like nothing Crow had ever built, nothing he had ever seen built. It looked, to his experienced eye, like a monument, the kind of structure a person builds when they have stopped thinking about what is practical, started thinking about what is permanent. Willa was working at the far end of the structure, fitting a stone into the 3rd channel. Pruitt sat against the wall, breathing shallowly, watching her work with the critical attention of a foreman who could no longer do the labor himself, but could still spot a misaligned joint from across the room. Mistress Greer. Crow's voice filled the small space, echoed off the earth walls. What exactly is this? Willa, she fitted the stone, tested its seat, with a tap of her smaller hammer adjusted. A stove, Mr. Crow. That is not a stove. I have built structures in this region for 20 years. A stove is cast iron, engineered, tested. This is a pile of rocks inside a hole. Now she looked at him. Her eyes held no madness, no grief, no defiance. They held exhaustion, the deep, structural exhaustion of a person who has been working beyond their body's limits for weeks, overlaid with something Crow did not immediately recognize. Later, reviewing the conversation in his mind, he would identify it as certainty. Not the loud certainty he himself carried, the certainty of a man who has been right so many times that rightness has become part of his identity. This was a quieter thing. The certainty of a person who has seen something work in their mind's eye, felt its logic in their hands, understood it through labor rather than authority. 3 problems, Crow continued, his voice carrying the systematic confidence of a man presenting a case he has already won. Ventilation. You have no draft system, I can see. The smoke from your fire will fill this space in minutes. Carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless. It will kill your children in their sleep before you know anything is wrong. He paused, waiting for her reaction. She gave none. Moisture. The earth is wet. This room is underground. Every surface here is sweating moisture you cannot see. Add fire, you add steam. The air becomes a breeding ground for lung disease. Your children will develop fever before Christmas. Another pause. Willa's face remained still. Structural failure. This ceiling is sod over old timber. The timber is decades past its useful life. The weight above you, dirt, snow, whatever accumulates this winter, increases with every storm. When the ceiling fails, there will be no warning. It will come down on you, on the children, on this entire construction. He had delivered these 3 points in the tone of a man closing a legal argument. Each point was reasonable. Each was grounded in real experience, real knowledge. A man with Crow's background, a man who had spent 20 years building structures that kept families alive through Kansas winters, had earned the right to this certainty. He was not wrong by the light of everything he knew. Pruitt, from his position against the wall, spoke without raising his voice. The words came between breaths, each sentence a small investment of air he could not afford to waste. The chimney channel exits through a natural fissure in the limestone above, 4 feet of vertical rise before it reaches the surface. The temperature differential between the firebox gases at 600 degrees, the outside air at 20 degrees creates a draft stronger than any straight-pipe stove you have built, Mr. Crow. The S-curve does not impede the draft, it regulates it. Smoke moves through the channel, not into the room. I have breathed the air inside a catch-a-loafin for 12 years. My lungs failed from coal dust, not from stone stove smoke. Crow turned to look at him. The old man's authority was different from his own, not broad, but deeper, rooted in a specific experience that Crow could not match with general expertise. Moisture, Pruitt continued. The catch-a-loafin heats to a surface temperature of 150 degrees. It radiates heat continuously for 12 to 18 hours. The air inside this space will be drier than the air inside your house, Mr. Crow, because the stone drives moisture out of the earth walls through sustained radiant heating. I have seen this. I have lived in this. He coughed a wet, rattling sound that undermined his authority even as his words reinforced it. When the coughing subsided, he finished. The ceiling has held for 25 years or more. The timber is petrified, harder than the day it was cut. The sod above it is 3 feet deep, compressed by its own weight into a density that rivals brick. I have worked in mine tunnels supported by less. Crow stood in the center of the dugout, between the woman building the stove, the man who had lived with one. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, recalculating the particular discomfort of a man encountering information that does not fit the framework he has spent decades constructing. 12 years, you say, 12 winters. Pruitt met his eyes. I never once woke cold. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room when a large object has shifted position, a rearrangement of weight, of the distribution of authority between the people present. Crow looked at the catch-a-loafin, at Pruitt, at Willa, who had not stopped working during the entire exchange, who was now setting the next stone in the third flue channel with the steady hands of a woman who would continue building whether he approved or objected, or set the entire dugout on fire. He could feel his certainty bending. Not breaking. Denton Crow's certainty did not break easily, but bending the way a beam bends under a load it was not designed to carry. He did not have the knowledge to refute Pruitt's claims, did not have the experience to contradict them. What he had was 20 years of building one way, the way everyone built, the way that worked well enough most of the time, the way that was sanctioned by convention, by the collective agreement of every settlement on the plains. But working well enough most of the time was not the same as working. His own house, the finest in Bitter Fork, consumed 20 cords of oak per winter. His stove ran hot enough to redden its sides while the corners of his bedroom collected frost. He had never questioned this. It was simply the cost of surviving a Kansas winter, a cost measured in labor, in the permanent low-grade exhaustion of a family feeding an iron god that was never satisfied. Crow looked at Willa's woodpile stacked near the entrance. 3 cords of cottonwood, enough for 2 months in her cabin, burning the way iron burned, fast, hot, wasteful. But inside this dugout, with this stone stove, with the earth itself providing half the insulation, how long would 3 cords last? He did not ask the question aloud. He was not ready for the answer. I will not help with this, he said finally. His voice was quieter than when he had entered. I do not understand it. I do not trust what I do not understand, but I will not stop you. He looked at Pruitt. If those children come to harm, Silas, the town will hold you responsible alongside her. The town can hold what it likes. Pruitt's breathing was labored, but his gaze was steady. I will be dead before spring. What I am doing here is the last useful thing I will do on this earth. I would rather spend it on this than on anything else I can name. The words hung in the dugout's still air. Crow stared at the old man, at the sunken cheeks, the thin chest, the hands that shook slightly when they were not occupied with stone. He saw for the first time what Willa had seen from the beginning, a man who was not volunteering his time but spending his remaining supply of it investing the final reserves of a body that was closing down around him into a structure that would outlast him by decades. Crow turned, climbed the slope without another word. His footsteps faded. The wind took his presence the way it took everything, quickly, completely. Willa set the next stone. Pruitt coughed softly, caught his breath. He will not help. He will not interfere. In this town, that is the same as permission. It is not permission I need. No, it is stone. They worked until the light failed. What Crow did not do was tell the town he had withdrawn his objection. He returned to Bitter Fork, spoke to no one about what he had seen, offered no correction to the rumors that continued to circulate. Greer's folly grew in the town's imagination into something between a scandal, a cautionary tale. The widow was building a pagan altar in a cave. The widow was living underground like an animal. The widow had recruited a dying man to assist in her delusion. The children were being raised in a tomb. Willa stopped going to Whitmore's store. Jesse went instead, carrying a small list in his mother's handwriting, returning with flour, salt, matches, the bare necessities purchased with the dwindling supply of cash August had left in a tin box under the bed. Mr. Whitmore filled the boy's orders without comment, but his wife watched Jesse leave each time with an expression that was 1 part concern, 2 parts the grim satisfaction of a woman whose predictions about the Greer widow were proving correct. The isolation was complete. No one came to the cabin. No one visited the dugout. The small courtesies, the extra, the jar of preserves, the elbow touch at church, ceased entirely. Willa had refused the solution the community offered, had chosen a path that made no sense by any standard the town recognized, had rejected not just their help but their framework. She was beyond sympathy now. She had crossed into the territory where sympathy becomes surveillance, where concern becomes the prelude to intervention. She did not care, or rather, she cared in the way a person cares about weather during a house fire. The social consequences were real, present, undeniable. They were also irrelevant compared to the thing that would kill her family if she failed. The cachalophon was finished on the 28th of October. Pruitt laid the final capstone on the chimney channel, a thick slab of limestone he had selected 3 days earlier, tested for density by dropping it from waist height onto hard ground, listening for the tone. Dense stone rang, porous stone thudded. This one rang. He fitted it into position with hands that trembled from the effort, tapped it level with a smaller rock, ran his palm across the join. The structure was complete. Not beautiful. The surface was rough, the mortar lines uneven, the proportions massive rather than elegant. It looked like what it was, built by a dying man, a desperate woman, a 6-year-old sorter of stones. But it was solid, it was sound. The channels were clean, the joints were tight. The chimney drew air when Pruitt tested it by holding a lit match at the firebox opening, watching the flame bend inward, pulled by the draft. 2 tons of stone, 3 weeks of labor, a structure that would outlast every person who had built it. Pruitt stood beside the completed cachalophon for a long moment, both hands resting on the uppermost surface. His breathing was worse than when he had started. The weeks of exertion had cost him something his lungs could not repay. But his, in the dim light of the dugout, held an expression Willa had not seen on any face since August's death, peace. He lifted his hands from the stone, turned to the entrance, did not say goodbye, did not offer a speech, did not mark the moment with any ceremony. He climbed the slope, 1 labored step at a time, disappeared over the ridge. Willa found his note the next day, a scrap of paper tucked between the pages of August's journal near the final diagram. The handwriting was shaky but legible, each letter formed with the deliberate care of a man who knew his hands would not write many more words. The best house I ever helped build was the last one. Below that, his initials SP. She pressed the note flat against the page, closed the journal, set it on the shelf above the sleeping platform. Then she went back to work. There was still the matter of the chimney exit to seal, the sleeping platform to construct, the door to reinforce, the curing fires to build, careful fires designed not to heat the space but to slowly dry the clay mortar, to drive moisture from the joints without cracking them through thermal shock. Willa moved the family's possessions from the cabin in the first week of November. The journey was a series of trips, each one carrying what could fit in the handcart, blanket, cooking pot, the tin box with its diminishing supply of cash, August's trunk with the journal inside, Pearl's wrap, Jesse's carved horse. The cabin stood empty behind her, its door hanging open, its gaps whistling in the wind. She did not look back at it. She did not feel nostalgia. The cabin had never been a home. It had been a holding pattern, a place where she waited for something better or something worse, never sure which would arrive first. The dugout was dark. Jesse complained about this for approximately half a day before discovering that the absence of wind, the absolute total, unprecedented silence of a space surrounded by earth, was worth more than sunlight. Pearl declared the dugout the bear house, her name for it. adopted immediately by Jessie, never replaced by anything more formal. The bear house. They slept in the bear house. They ate in the bear house. They lived in the bear house, 15 feet underground, with 2 tons of stone between them, the winter that was coming. On the evening of November 9th, Willa lit the first true fire. The temperature outside had dropped below freezing 3 days earlier. Snow had fallen twice, light, preliminary dustings that melted by noon but promised heavier deposits to come. The sky had taken on the flat, metallic quality that Kansas skies developed in late autumn, a ceiling of gray that pressed down on the prairie like a lid being lowered onto a pot. Willa loaded the firebox with a small armful of cottonwood, perhaps 6 or 7 pieces no larger than her forearm. She struck a match. The kindling caught. The fire built quickly in the enclosed space, the draft pulling air through the firebox with a soft, steady rush. The flames were bright, contained, efficient. They did not roar the way the iron stove roared. They burned with a focused intensity that was closer to purpose than fury. Jesse sat on the sleeping platform, his arms around his knees, watching the fire through the small opening above the iron door. Pearl leaned against him, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes following the light. Willa sat on a stool near the firebox, the journal in her lap, watching the flames do exactly what August's father had designed them to do: burn hot, burn fast. The fire consumed the cottonwood in slightly under an hour. The heat was not escaping, it was traveling. Through the firebox walls into the first channel, through the first channel into the second, through the second into the third, at every turn pressing against stone, at every surface surrendering temperature. The chimney. Willa checked it by stepping outside into the cold. Plume of smoke so faint, so cool. She could hold her hand 6 inches above the opening without discomfort. The heat was being captured, stored, banked. After an hour following the journal's instructions precisely, Willa closed the damper, cut the air supply. The fire died, not suddenly, but in a slow, the coals dimming from orange to red to gray. Silence, no crackle, no roar, no desperate ticking of expanding metal, just the deep padded quiet of an underground room surrounded by earth. They waited. It came slowly, so gradually that Willa was not sure at first that she was feeling it. A warmth that did not originate from the air. The air temperature had not changed perceptibly. It came from the surfaces. The floor beneath her feet, which had been the neutral 52 degrees of the earth, began to feel less cold. The wall nearest the cachalophin developed a faint radiance that was not visible but tactile, a warmth she could sense with the back of her hand from 6 inches away. The cachalophin itself, which had been cool stone an hour earlier, was transforming. Its surface was warm, not the aggressive skin-cracking heat of iron, a warmth that invited touch rather than punishing it. The warmth of a living body, the warmth of a hand held out in welcome. Jesse unfolded from the sleeping platform, crossed the small room, placed his palm flat against the cachalophin's surface. His eyes went wide. He pulled his hand away, looked at his palm as if expecting to see a mark there, pressed his hand back against the stone. "Mama, the rock is warm. That's the idea, Jesse." He moved his hand to a different spot. Warm there too, another spot. Warm. The entire structure, 2 tons of stone, clay, sand, labor, was alive with captured heat, radiating it outward in every direction, filling the small underground room with a presence that was not aggressive, not desperate, not temporary. It was patient, it was steady. It was the warmth of something that had made a promise it intended to keep for a long, long time. Pearl climbed off the platform, toddled over, pressed her cheek against the stone. She smiled. The first real smile Willa had seen from her daughter in weeks. "Warm bear," Pearl announced. "The bear house has a warm bear." Willa placed her own hand on the cachalophin. The stone hummed beneath her palm, not with sound, but with stored energy, the accumulated heat of an hour's fire held in 2 tons of mass, releasing itself with the patience of something that had nowhere to go, nothing to prove, no wind to. That night they slept without shivering. No extra blankets, no coats worn to bed. No waking at midnight to feed an iron stove that would only scream for an hour before going silent, just warmth, pervasive, steady, coming from everywhere, belonging to no single source. The stone told its story, the earth held its silence. The wind, somewhere above them, did whatever the wind did, it no longer mattered. Willa woke at 2 in the morning, pulled from sleep by a habit her body had not yet abandoned, the habit of rising to feed the stove, the nightly ritual of stumbling through cold darkness to push another log into the iron mouth before the temperature dropped below the threshold where ice formed on the water bucket. She lay still, blinking. The room was dark. The fire had been dead for 6 hours. The air was warm. She reached out from under her single blanket, placed her hand on the wall of the cachalophin, which stood within arm's reach of the sleeping platform. Warm. Not residual warmth, not the fading echo of a fire recently extinguished. Warm with the steady, deep, renewable heat of mass that had absorbed more energy than it could release in 6 hours. in 12 hours and 18. Warm the way a person is warm from the inside without effort. Above, muffled by 3 feet of solid, insulated by the enormous thermal mass of the earth itself, the wind was blowing. She could feel it, not hear it, feel it, as the faintest vibration in the ceiling, a tremor so slight it might have been imagination. The wind was doing its work up there, tearing at the grass, scouring the empty cabin she had left behind, searching for cracks in every structure in Bitter Fork, finding them, exploiting them, stealing heat from iron stoves that would need to be fed again in an hour or 2 or 3. Down here the stone remembered. Willa lay in the dark with her hand on warm stone, her children breathing softly beside her, the fire, the wind irrelevant. For the first time since she had pulled August's cooling hand into her own on a September morning that already felt like another lifetime, for the first time since the world had narrowed to a corridor of grief, survival, Willa Greer believed they would live through the winter. Not hoped, not prayed, believed. The stone had kept its promise, the story was being told. She closed her eyes, left her hand where it was, fell back into the deepest sleep she had known in months. Above her the wind howled. It did not matter. It would not matter again. The sky over Kansas turned a color on the morning of January 12th that no one in Bitter Fork had ever seen. It was not gray, it was not white. It was a shade between yellow bronze, the color of a bruise forming on something too large to comprehend, a discoloration of the atmosphere itself that pressed down on the prairie with a physical weight. The air had a strange electric quality, a metallic taste that sat on the tongue the way copper does when a person bites down on a coin. Dogs refused to go outside. Horses stamped in their stalls, rolling their eyes at walls as if they could see through them to something approaching from the north that their owners could not yet perceive. Denton Crow stood on his porch at 7 in the morning, looking at that sky with the particular unease of a man who has survived enough Kansas winters to recognize the difference between ordinary cold, something else. He had seen blizzards. He had built through them, sheltered against them, measured his life by the rhythm of seasons that included them as a regular feature. This was different. The barometric pressure had dropped so sharply overnight that his ears ached. The thermometer nailed to the porch post, which had read 22 degrees at sunrise, now read 14. It was still falling. The mercury was descending with the steady, unhesitating movement of something being pulled downward by a force that had no intention of stopping. By noon, the temperature was 3 degrees above zero. By 2 o'clock, it had crossed below. The sky had darkened to the color of iron, the yellow bronze giving way to a gray so deep it registered as black at the horizon line. The wind, which had been absent all morning, an absence more frightening than any gale, arrived at 2:30 with a sound that Crow would remember for the rest of his life. Not a howl, not a moan, a detonation, a concussive wall of air that struck the west face of his house with enough force to make the timbers groan, to rattle the glass in the window frames, to send a picture crashing from the parlor wall. Behind the wind came the snow, but calling it snow was like calling an avalanche a dusting. The flakes were not flakes at all. They were crystals, tiny, hard, sharp as ground glass, driven horizontally by wind that exceeded 60 miles per hour. Within 10 minutes of the first gust, visibility dropped to zero, not reduced visibility, not poor visibility, zero. A man could not see his own hand at the end of his outstretched arm. The blizzard sealed Bitter Fork inside itself. Inside the Crow house, the finest structure in the settlement, the battle began immediately. The largest cast-iron model available from the Topeka catalog, a massive beast that Crow had installed with the pride of a man furnishing a cathedral, was already running at full capacity. His son, a 17-year-old built like his father, made the first trip to the woodshed at 3 o'clock. The distance was 30 feet. He tied a rope to the porch rail, held the other end in his fist, walked blind into the white fury. He was gone for 12 minutes. When he returned, arms loaded with oak, his face was a mask of ice. The snow had driven into every fold of his clothing, melting against his skin, refreezing. His eyelashes were welded shut. He dumped the wood beside the stove, bent double, coughing. Crow fed the stove. The iron accepted the oak with the indifference of a god receiving tribute, consuming it steadily, producing a sphere of scorching heat that extended approximately 4 feet from the stove's surface before dying. Beyond that radius, the house was losing. The wind found seams Crow had never known existed, hairline cracks in the window putty, microscopic gaps where the clapboard met the framing, channels in the sod roof that 20 years of settlement had opened without anyone noticing. Cold air poured through these openings with the persistence of water through a dam's fractures. The stove fought the infiltration. The infiltration won. The air temperature near the stove was 90 degrees. The air temperature in the bedroom, 15 feet away, was 31. Water left in a cup on the bedroom nightstand developed a skin of ice. The son made the second trip to the woodshed an hour later. The third trip an hour after that. Each trip was more dangerous than the last. The wind had increased. The snow accumulation against the west wall of the house was climbing, 3 feet by 5 o'clock, 4 feet by 6. The woodshed door, which opened outward, required the boy to dig before he could reach the fuel. Each expedition consumed 20 minutes, produced enough wood for 60 minutes of burning. The mathematics were simple, terrifying. The stove consumed faster than the sun could supply. The wood in the shed, which had seemed inexhaustible in October, 20 cords of seasoned oak. His declaration of competence, was shrinking at a rate that transformed abundance into scarcity in hours rather than months. Mrs. Crow gathered the younger children in the kitchen, nearest the stove. She piled quilts on them, she heated stones in the firebox, wrapped them in cloth, placed them at their feet. She did everything that a competent, experienced prairie woman does when the temperature inside her own house drops below the point where bare skin begins to lose function. Her face was calm. Her hands were steady. Behind her eyes, in the private space where mothers keep the calculations they do not share with their children, she was counting wood, counting hours, counting the distance between what they had left, what they would need if this storm lasted another day, another 2 days. 3. Crow stood beside his stove, feeding it, watching the wood disappear. The roar of the fire competed with the roar of the wind. Both were losing to each other, both were consuming something irreplaceable. He was the master builder of Bitter Fork. He had constructed this house with his own hands, selected every board, driven every nail. It was the best structure for 30 miles. It was failing. 3 miles west, inside the hillside, the blizzard was a rumor. Willa heard it the way a person hears a distant highway from inside a well-built room, a continuous low vibration, more felt than heard, transmitted through the earth above her as a faint hum that registered in the bones of her skull rather than her eardrums. The sound carried no information about what was happening on the surface. It could have been wind, thunder, the passage of a distant train. It was simply vibration. The earth absorbed it, filtered it, reduced it to an abstraction. The temperature inside the dugout was 67 degrees. Willa had lit the cachalophon 5 hours earlier, burning a single armload of cottonwood in a fire that lasted 45 minutes. The damper had been closed at 6 o'clock. The fire had died by 6:30. Now approaching midnight, the stone was doing its work. The surface temperature of the cachalophon was 148 degrees. Willa could not measure this precisely, but she could hold her palm against the surface for 3 seconds before the heat became uncomfortable. This meant the outer face had not yet reached its peak. Over the next 6 hours, the heat stored deep in the 2-ton mass would continue migrating outward, reaching the surface in waves, maintaining the room temperature without fluctuation through the night, into the morning, possibly into the following afternoon. Jesse slept on the platform with Pearl curled against his side, one blanket over both of them. Pearl's thumb was in her mouth. Jesse's arm was around his sister, not protectively, not anxious, but with the casual possessiveness of a boy who has learned to sleep beside his sister without thinking about it. Their breathing was slow, deep, synchronized. The air they exhaled did not form clouds. The room was warm enough that the human breath, the ambient temperature, occupied the same range. In the Crow house, every exhale was visible. Here breathing was invisible, a small thing. The difference between a body at war with its environment, a body at peace with it. On the flat upper surface of the cachalophon, a small iron pot held a dried Venice turnips. The residual heat kept the liquid at a temperature just below simmering, not cooking, but holding, maintaining. The smell filled the dugout with a domesticity so profound, so incongruous with the apocalypse raging overhead that it bordered on the surreal. Bread was baking, not in an stone surface itself, a flat round of dough placed directly on the warm stone, rising slowly in the radiant heat, browning on the bottom, filling the underground room with a fragrance that belonged to kitchens, to civilization, to safety. Willa sat at the rough table, mending a tear in Jesse's coat. The tallow lamp burned steadily, its flame vertical, undisturbed by drafts because there were no drafts. The needle moved through the fabric with small, precise stitches. She was calm. Not performing calm, not suppressing panic, not drawing on reserves of courage to maintain an appearance of composure. She was simply calm. The way a person is calm when the fundamental question of survival has been answered, when the architecture of safety is not a hope or a prayer but a physical fact surrounding her on every side, earth above, warmth radiating from a structure that had absorbed an hour's worth of fire, would return it over 24 hours of patient, unhurried release. The cottonwood pile sat against the east wall, still more than half full. She had burned less fuel in 2 months than Crow had burned in 2 days. On the second night of the blizzard, near 2 in the morning, Willa heard the knocking. It was almost indistinguishable from the vibration of the storm itself, a rhythmic interruption in the continuous hum that could have been a branch hitting something, a piece of debris caught in the wind, the natural percussion of a world being dismantled. But it repeated 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. The pattern was human. She put down her mending, pulled on her coat, not because the dugout was cold, but because opening the door would invite the storm inside for however long it took to deal with whatever was on the other side. She crossed to the entrance, pressed her shoulder against the plank door, pushed. The door moved 6 inches before hitting resistance. Snow had drifted against it. The entrance was partially sheltered by the hillside above, but enough to require force. She pushed harder. The gap widened to 18 inches. Wind rushed through the opening with a shriek that shattered the dugout's silence, carrying a horizontal blast of snow crystals that stung her face like thrown sand. The cold was extraordinary, not merely low temperature but a physical assault, a violence of air that seemed to have a purpose beyond meteorology, as if the atmosphere itself had developed malice. In the narrow gap of the open door, lit by the faint glow of the tallow lamp behind her, she saw a shape. Not standing, kneeling, half buried in the drift that had formed against the hillside, one arm, fist clenched, the posture of a person who had been knocking on a door with the last reserves of a body that had stopped cooperating several minutes ago. Thomas Whitmore was 14 years old. He was Mr. Whitmore's eldest son, the boy who stocked shelves at the general store, who carried flour sacks to wagons, who once helped Jessie wrestle the handcart out of a mud hole near the creek without being asked or thanked. He had gone out at dusk on the first day of the blizzard to fetch wood from the family's outdoor pile, a task he had performed 100 times before. The distance was 40 feet. In the whiteout, 40 feet became infinity. He turned the wrong direction coming back, walked straight into the open prairie. By the time he realized his error, the house was gone, swallowed by a wall of white that eliminated every landmark, every reference point, every certainty about which direction led home, which direction led to death. He walked for how long he would never be certain. An hour, perhaps 2. The cold worked on him systematically, fingers first, then toes, then the exposed skin of his face. His coat, adequate for a 30-second trip to the woodpile, was insufficient armor against sustained exposure. The wind found every opening. The snow packed into his collar, his cuffs, the gap between his boot tops, his trouser legs. He stopped feeling his hands. His feet became wooden blocks at the ends of his legs, present but non-functional. Then he saw the smoke, a thread of pale gray against the darkness, so thin, so faint it might have been a hallucination, a final gift from a brain shutting down. But it was rising from a specific point in the snow-covered hillside, a narrow stone pipe barely visible above the drift. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. He moved toward it with the last coordinated effort his body could produce, half crawling, until his knees hit the snow-covered mound that concealed the dugout entrance. He found the door by feel. He knocked 3 times with a fist he could no longer open. Willa grabbed his coat with both hands, hauled him through the gap in the door, dragged him inside. She put her weight against the plank, forced it closed. The shriek of the wind cut off, the silence returned, filling the space like water filling a vessel. Thomas lay on the earthen floor, shaking. Not the voluntary shiver of a cold person trying to generate heat, a deep, convulsive tremor that ran through his entire body, a muscular rebellion against the temperature his core had reached. His lips were blue-white. His fingers, when Willa pried them from the fists they had locked into, were the color of candle wax. His boot, when she pulled them off, revealed toes that were pale, stiff, frighteningly bloodless. Jessie was awake. He had risen from the platform the moment the door opened, standing at the edge of the sleeping area with Pearl still unconscious beside him, watching his mother drag a boy twice his size across the floor. He did not speak. He moved to the cachalofen, placed his hand on the surface, testing the temperature, confirming what he already knew, then pulled the single spare blanket from the shelf, brought it to his mother. Willa wrapped Thomas's feet in dry cloth. She positioned him on the floor beside the cachalofen, close enough that the radiant heat would reach his skin without the shock of direct contact against the hot surface. The stone would do its work, not with the aggressive, localized heat of an iron stove, which would have burned frostbitten skin, but with the gentle, pervasive warmth of a body that released its stored energy slowly, evenly, at a temperature calibrated by physics rather than by the desperation of whoever was feeding it fuel. Thomas stopped shaking after 30 minutes. His color returned in stages, first, then cheeks, then the fingertips that Willa massaged between her own hands, restoring circulation with the patient, repetitive pressure of a woman who understood that frostbite was a process, that the damage could be reversed if warmth arrived before the tissue died. He opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling, the heavy timber, the sod, the roots dangling from the prairie above. Looked at the cachelophan, this enormous presence radiating heat beside him. Looked at Willa's face, lit by the tallow lamp, focused, not frightened. Where his voice cracked, barely functional. "You're safe, you're underground. The storm can't reach you here." He turned his head toward the warmth. The stone face of the cachelophan glowed faintly in the lamplight, its rough surface holding the captured heat of a fire that had burned hours ago, releasing it with the patience of something that had no concept of urgency. Thomas Whitmore started to cry. Not. His hands were numb. His feet were numb. The physical suffering had been temporarily suspended by the body's triage system. He cried from the transition, from the passage between dying, being warm, from the overwhelming, disorienting relief of a body that had been preparing for one outcome, abruptly received another. Pearl woke up. She looked at the crying boy on the floor, at her mother kneeling beside him, at Jessie standing with the blanket. She climbed off the platform, walked to Thomas on her short legs, sat down beside him. She did not touch him. She placed her stuffed rabbit on his chest, with the solemn generosity of a 4-year-old offering the only medicine she possessed. Then she looked at her mother. The warm bear fixed him. "Mama." Thomas stayed in the dugout for the remainder of the blizzard. He slept near the cachelophan, wrapped in blankets, his feet positioned where the radiant heat could work on the damaged tissue without overwhelming it. The color returned to his toes over the next 2 days. The whiteness faded to red, then to the healthy pink of restored circulation. He would keep all 10 toes. The earth, the design of a man who had been dead for decades. They had saved his feet, possibly his life. On the morning of January 15th, the wind stopped. The cessation was sudden. One moment the vibration hummed through the ceiling, the next it was gone, replaced by a silence so total it felt like a physical event, as if someone had placed a hand over the mouth of the world. Willa opened the door. The snow that had blocked it was crusted with ice now, hardened by the final hours of wind into a surface almost strong enough to walk on. She pushed through it, stepped out onto the hillside, squinted into a brightness that was painful after 3 days of lamplight. The prairie was unrecognizable. What had been a landscape of rolling grass, fenced, distant rooftops was now a white abstraction, smooth, featureless, broken only by the angular shapes of drifts that had resculpted every vertical surface into aerodynamic curves. The sky was so blue it looked artificial, the deep, vibrating blue that comes only after a storm has scoured the atmosphere clean of every particle. Thomas stood beside her, wrapped in a blanket, breathing air so cold it made his teeth ache. He looked east, toward Bitterfork, toward the rooftop of his father's store, if it was still visible, if the drifts had not consumed it. "They think I'm dead. Then you should go tell them otherwise." He looked at her. At the dugout entrance behind her, the humble plank door, the narrow chimney pipe from which a thin wisp of pale smoke still rose with perfect, unhurried calm. At the warm air spilling from the open doorway like an exhalation. "Mrs. Greer, what is this place?" Willa looked at the hillside, the snow, the impossible smoke. "A home," she said. "That's all." Thomas left, walking east through the drifts, his blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Willa watched him until his shape became a dark speck against the white, then disappeared over a ridge. She went back inside, closed the door. The warmth welcomed her back without comment. In Bitterfork, the aftermath was a reckoning. Doors were dug out. People emerged blinking, wearing the expressions of survivors, the particular combination of relief, residual terror that sits on a face after a brush with something larger than human planning can address. The first inventory was wood, every household reported. The results were catastrophic. Crow's 20 cords of oak, his winter's supply, his declaration of competence, the physical evidence of his authority, had been reduced to 4 cords in 72 hours. Dove had consumed 16 cords in 3 days. Other families were worse. The Reeves family was completely out. The Mortons had enough for a week, perhaps less. The aggregate picture was clear. Bitterfork did not have enough fuel to survive the remainder of the winter if another storm of similar magnitude arrived. The settlement that had entered January with confidence was now staring at February with dread. Thomas Whitmore walked into his father's store at noon, still wrapped in Willa Greer's blanket. The reunion was what one would expect. His mother collapsed against him. His father gripped his shoulders with hands that shook. His younger siblings crowded around with the bewildered joy of children who had processed their brother's absence without understanding its permanence. The store filled with neighbors. The story spread. Thomas had survived. He had survived not in a barn, not in a snowbank, not by some miracle of endurance. He had survived in the dugout, in Greer's Folly. The place the town had designated as a monument to a widow's madness had saved the store owner's son. Crow heard the news at his own kitchen table, where he sat with his head in his hands, staring at the diminished woodpile through the window. His wife brought the information in the careful, neutral tone of a woman delivering a fact that she knew would detonate inside her husband's understanding of the world. Thomas Whitmore is alive. He spent the storm in the Greer woman's dugout. He says it was warm inside. He says the children were healthy. He says the woodpile was barely touched. Crow did not look up. His hands remained where they were, pressed against his temples, fingers interlocked, the posture of a man trying to hold something together that was already coming apart. Barely touched. That is what the boy says. Barely touched. 3 days of the worst blizzard in Kansas history, a storm that had consumed 16 cords of his best oak, that had pushed his house, the finest structure in Bitter Fork, to the edge of failure. The widow's cottonwood pile was barely touched. The arithmetic was impossible. The arithmetic was also true. He stood, reached for his coat. His wife did not ask where he was going. She already knew. The walk took 2 hours. Snowshoes over packed drifts, the afternoon sun casting long blue shadows across the white surface. Crow did not hurry. Each step was heavy with the accumulated weight of what he was walking toward. Not just a dugout, not just a widow, but the dismantling of a certainty he had carried for 20 years. A framework of knowledge that had defined his authority, his identity, his understanding of what kept people alive on the Kansas prairie. He saw the smoke first, the same thin wisp Thomas had seen rising from the same narrow pipe with the same unhurried calm, smoke that was not laboring, smoke that was not fighting, smoke that was breathing. He dug at the entrance. The snow came away in chunks. The door appeared, rough, simple frame, nothing remarkable. He pushed it open. The warmth hit him the way the truth hits a man who has been wrong about something fundamental, not with violence, but with a completeness that leaves no room for the version of reality he carried in with him. It was everywhere. In the air, in the floor, in the walls. It was not coming from a single source. It was the room itself, the stone, the earth, the entire constructed environment radiating a temperature that belonged to a different season than the one raging outside. Willa Greer sat at her table. Coffee, the smell of it, rich, domestic, belonging to a morning in a warm kitchen, not to the 4th day after a historic blizzard in an underground shelter. She was grinding the beans with a hand mill, the same steady circular motion she performed every morning, the gesture of a woman for whom this catastrophe had been an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Jesse sat on the floor carving something from a piece of soft wood with a knife that was too large for his hands. Pearl was on the sleeping platform, talking to her stuffed rabbit in the private, elaborate language that 4-year-olds use when they believe no one important is listening. The cachalophon stood in the center of it all. Not glowing, not roaring, not ticking with the frantic expansion of overheated metal, just present, just warm. A 2-ton body of stone, clay, human labor, releasing the heat it had stored with the same patience it had shown every day since November, the same physics, the same promise kept. The woodpile. Willa's 3 cords of cottonwood, the fuel Crow had declared a death sentence in October. The supply that every man in Bitter Fork had looked at with the grim certainty that it would not last past Christmas. It stood against the wall, neat, organized, still containing more than half its original volume. Denton Crow stood in the doorway of a room he had called a tomb, wearing a coat crusted with ice, his beard frozen, his hands numb from digging through snow, his body carrying the exhaustion of 3 days, spent feeding an iron stove that had eaten his winter's worth of oak while failing to keep ice off his bedroom nightstand. He looked at the warm room, the healthy children, the calm woman, the untouched woodpile, the breathing stone. His eyes moved to the cachalophon. He pulled off one glove, crossed the room without being invited, without speaking, without the authority or the certainty or the commanding voice that had defined every interaction he had conducted in this settlement for 2 decades. He placed his bare palm against the stone. It was warm. Not the warmth of a surface recently heated, the warmth of a mass that had absorbed energy so deeply, stored it so completely, that the concept of the fire being out was irrelevant. The fire had been out for hours. The stone did not care. The stone had its own schedule, its own timeline, its own relationship with heat that operated independently of flame, of fuel, of the entire desperate cycle that iron stoves imposed on the families who served them. Crow's hand stayed on the stone. His face underwent a transformation that Willa watched without comment, the dismantling of something, layer by layer. The certainty went first, collapsing inward like a structure whose load-bearing walls have been removed. Then the authority which was built on the certainty, which had nowhere to stand once its foundation was gone. Then the identity, the master builder, the expert, the man whose word was law in matters of construction, shelter, survival. All of it fell away, leaving behind something Willa had not expected to see on this particular face: openness, the raw, defenseless openness of a person encountering a truth so large that there is no room left for pretense. He sat down. Not in a chair, his legs simply stopped supporting him, depositing him on the nearest horizontal surface, which happened to be the edge of the sleeping platform. His shoulders curved forward, his jaw tightened, his eyes were wet. He was not crying about the stove. He was not crying about being wrong. He was crying about the 3 days he had just survived, 3 days of feeding wood into a machine that devoured it without satisfaction. 3 days of watching his family huddle under quilts while ice formed on surfaces 10 feet from a stove burning hot enough to glow. 3 days of knowing, with the certainty of a man who understands construction, that his house was failing. His knowledge was insufficient. His authority was hollow. Willa set a cup of coffee on the platform beside him, a piece of bread from the cachalophan's surface still warm, the crust golden brown. He looked at the coffee, at the bread. At her hands, rougher than his now, the hands of a woman who had spent 3 months hauling stone, mixing clay, building something that every expert in her world had declared impossible. The word, when it came, was barely audible, a single syllable, a question stripped of everything except need. How? Willa did not smile. She did not remind him of his predictions, his warnings, his pronouncement that she was endangering her children through grief, ignorance. She saw what was in front of her, not a defeated enemy, but a frightened father, a man whose world had been rearranged without his consent. You burn the fire to heat the air, Mr. Crow. The wind takes the air. I burn the fire to heat the stone. The stone stays. She poured herself a cup from the same pot, sat across from him. The lamp between them cast a steady flame, no flicker, no draft to disturb it. An iron stove shouts. The wind steals every word. A stone hearth tells its story quietly. It speaks all through the night. Crow held the cup in both hands. The warmth of the coffee traveled through his palms, up his wrists, into the frozen architecture of his forearms. He drank. The bread was dense, slightly sweet, baked by the residual heat of a stove that had not held a fire since the previous evening. Pruitt knew this. He built with you. He lived with a cachalophan for 12 years, Pennsylvania. He knew it would work because he had slept beside one for over a decade. Why didn't he build one for himself? Willa's gaze moved to the cornerstone, the large flat piece of limestone at the base of the cachalophan, the first stone laid, the one Pruitt had positioned with his scarred, trembling hands on the first day he appeared at the dugout unannounced. He was dying, Mr. Crow. His lungs were done. He knew he would not see spring. Building this stove was the last useful thing he wanted to do with what was left. Crow looked at the cornerstone. He had not known Pruitt well. The man was a peripheral figure in Bitter Fork, tolerated, not integrated. The realization that a dying man had spent his final reserves of strength building a stove for a widow the entire town had abandoned landed somewhere deep in Crow's chest, in the space between his lungs where guilt accumulates when it has nowhere else to go. He set the cup down, pulled his notebook from his coat pocket, the small leather-bound pad he carried everywhere filled with measurements, angles, calculations. He opened it to a blank page. Looked at Willa. I need to see the journal. Not a demand. Not the voice of authority requisitioning information. The voice of a builder asking another builder to share plans. Willa retrieved the journal from the shelf, set it on the table between them. Crow opened it, began reading August's margin notes, studying Heinrich's diagrams. His pencil moved across his own notebook, copying measurements, sketching adaptations. He was silent for 15 minutes. Working through the engineering with the focused attention of a man who has just discovered that the discipline he has practiced for 20 years has an entire branch he never knew existed. The limestone from the Flint Hills, it's denser than the sandstone I've been using for foundations. Better thermal mass, better heat retention. He looked up. I know where to quarry it. I have the equipment. What are you saying, Mr. Crow? He closed the notebook, met her eyes. I am saying that when the snow melts, we need new drawings, adapted for framed houses, not dugouts. Every family in Bitter Fork needs one of these. He paused. I was wrong. I am not good at saying that. My wife will confirm. But I know how to build. If you show me what to build, I will build it. Crow returned to Bitter Fork that afternoon carrying the notebook filled with sketches, measurements, the beginning of a translation between Heinrich's ancestral engineering, the specific materials available in Kansas. He walked into the general store where a dozen men had gathered to discuss the wood crisis. They looked at him, the master builder, the authority, the man whose word was law. Gather everyone. Church building, tonight. The meeting filled the small church to its walls. Every family in Bitter Fork sent someone. Crow stood at the front beside the simple wooden lectern, his notebook open. He did not perform humility. He was not a man built for performance. He delivered facts. 3 days of blizzard. His house, the best in the settlement, had consumed 16 cords of seasoned oak. Interior temperature in the far bedroom, 31 degrees. His stove, the largest in the region, running at maximum capacity, had failed to prevent ice from forming on standing water inside his own home. Willa Greer's dugout, 3 miles west, heated by a masonry stove built from local stone according to plans from her husband's family journal, had maintained a steady 67 degrees throughout the same blizzard. Her fuel consumption for the entire 3-day period was less than what Crow had burned in a single evening. Thomas Whitmore, who was present, standing at the back with his father, confirmed the account. He described the warmth, the silence, the bread baking on the stove surface, the children sleeping in wool shirts while his own family shivered under every quilt they owned. The church was silent, the kind of silence that follows the collapse of something structural, not the structure of a building, but the structure of a belief system, a collective understanding of how survival worked, what tools were adequate, what expertise could be trusted. Someone in the back row spoke the name that everyone was thinking: Greer's Folly. Crow's response was immediate, flat, carrying the weight of a man correcting an error he himself had helped create. Not anymore. Spring came slowly, the way Kansas springs do, not as a season but as a negotiation between the cold that refuses to leave, the warmth that insists on arriving. The snow melted in stages, the creeks swelled. The grass, pressed flat under months of ice, began to straighten, green, reclaim the prairie as if nothing had happened. Crow appeared at the dugout in March with lumber tools, 2 hired men from the settlement. He brought blueprints, his own, drawn from the measurements in his notebook, adapted from the principles in August's journal. The masonry heater for a framed house was different from the dugout version. It required a proper foundation, a reinforced floor to bear the weight, a chimney system integrated with the existing roof structure. The engineering was more complex. The principle was identical. Heat the stone, let the stone heat the room, make the heat pay rent. The Whitmore family store was retrofitted first. Mr. Whitmore donated the space, the labor. His wife, the same woman who had watched Jesse leave the store each week with the grim satisfaction of confirmed predictions, mixed mortar alongside Willa, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her face wearing the expression of a person whose predictions had been wrong in a way that saved her son's life. The following winter, the Whitmores burned a quarter of their previous year's wood. Their children never woke cold. The store stayed warm enough that customers lingered, talked, formed the casual bonds that transform a settlement from a collection of claims into a community. The Reeves family was next, then the Mortons. Then, in a gesture that carried more symbolic weight than practical necessity, Denton Crow tore out his own cast-iron stove, the largest in the region, the beast he had fed with such desperate devotion during the blizzard, replaced it with a cachalafin built from Flint Hills limestone quarried by his own crew, designed in collaboration with a widow who had never built anything before October of 1887. He invited Willa to lay the cornerstone. She declined. She had Pruitt's memory to honor. She asked Crow to place the first stone himself, to make it his own, to integrate the knowledge rather than borrow it, to become a builder of masonry heaters rather than a follower of someone else's plans. He did. With his calloused hands, he set the cornerstone, tapped at level, checked the alignment with the same exacting eye he brought to every structure he built. Then he stood back, looked at the foundation, nodded once. The sound of axes in autumn changed. Less desperate chopping. Smaller wood piles that seemed inadequate by the old standards but were more than sufficient by the new ones. The economy of survival in Bitterfork shifted. Less labor spent on fuel meant more labor available for farming, for building, for the 100 tasks that a community needs accomplished, but can never get to when its primary energy is consumed by the effort of staying warm. Willa never sought recognition. She attended no meetings. She made no speeches. When families came to her with questions about construction, about mortar consistency, about the proper angle for a flue channel turn, she answered with the plain, practical directness of a woman who had learned by doing, not by theorizing. She did not hold her knowledge over anyone. She did not remind the community of the months they had spent calling her work a folly, her judgment madness, her motherhood reckless. She simply shared what she knew, the way August had shared his translations in the margins of his father's journal, quietly, specifically, for the benefit of whoever needed it. Silas Pruitt died on the 3rd of February, 3 weeks after the blizzard. His lungs, which had been failing for years, completed their decline on a cold Tuesday morning in his one-room cabin at the edge of town. A neighbor found him in his bed, peaceful. The word reached Willa through Jesse, who heard it at Whitmore's store during his weekly supply run. Willa went into the dugout alone that afternoon. She closed the door. She placed her hand on the cornerstone, the large, flat limestone that Pruitt had laid with hands that shook from illness, but moved with the precision of 30 years' experience. She sat on the floor beside the catchlofen, her back against the warm stone, her palm flat against the surface. She did not cry. She had spent herself on crying months ago when August died, when the world narrowed, when the wood ran low. What she felt now was not grief but gratitude, the specific, unsentimental gratitude of a person who received exactly what she needed from a man who had nothing left to give except the thing that mattered most. The best house I ever helped build was the last one. She could hear his breathing, that shallow, labored whisper in the silence of the dugout. She could see his scarred hands on the stone. She could feel his presence in the warmth that surrounded her, the heat stored in the mass he had shaped, the physics he had understood, the knowledge he had transmitted through demonstration rather than lecture. She sat for an hour. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, went outside to split wood for the evening fire. The small fire, the only fire the stone would need to remember the whole night through. In April, when the last frost had passed, Willa took a chisel from August's toolbox, a small steel chisel he had used for fine work, for the detailed carpentry he was better at imagining than executing. She knelt at the catchalofen, positioned the chisel against the lintel stone above the firebox door, began to carve. The work took 3 days. She was not a stonemason. The letters were uneven, the depth inconsistent, the lines wavering in places where the limestone resisted the chisel's edge, but the words were legible. They were the words August had copied from his father's journal, the phrase that had traveled from the mines of the old country to the coal fields of Pennsylvania, to the pages of a leather-bound book, to the hands of a widow in Kansas who had never seen a catchalofen before October, had never touched one before November, had staked her children's lives on one before the first snow fell. Das Eisenschreit aber der Steine erinnert sich. Below the inscription, in her own hand, she carved the English, iron shouts, but the stone remembers. Years passed. The dugout remained, maintained first by Willa, then by the community, then by the town that Bitterfork eventually became. It was preserved the way small towns preserve the things that changed them, not with plaques or ceremonies, but with the simple act of not tearing it down, of keeping the path clear, of telling the story to children who had not been alive when it happened. On an afternoon in autumn, with the light going gold through the bluestem grass on the hills above, an elderly Denton Crow brought his grandson to the dugout. The boy was 9, old enough to climb the talus slope without help, young enough to find the underground room thrilling rather than historical. He ducked through the entrance, stood blinking in the cool dimness, his eyes adjusting. The catchalofen stood where it had always stood, massive, silent, its surfaces worn smooth by decades of human hands touching it, resting against it, reaching for it during winter nights when the stone was warm, pressing palms to it during summer visits when the stone was cool, the neutral temperature of the earth it sat inside. The mortar joints were darker than the stone, the clay hardened to a permanence that outlasted the people who had mixed it with their bare feet. The iron door of the firebox was rusted at the hinges, but solid, functional, capable of being opened, loaded, fired exactly as it had been fired on a November evening in 1887. The boy ran his hand along the surface. The stone was cool, the fire had not been lit in weeks, but it held a different kind of memory now, the memory of the thousands of fires it had contained, the decades of heat it had stored, released, stored again. The surface was polished by touch, by time, by the particular erosion that human contact produces on stone, a smoothness that sandpaper cannot replicate, that only comes from years of hands laid flat against a surface with purpose, with need, with gratitude. "Grandpa, why do people keep this old thing?" Crow stood near the entrance, his frame diminished by age, his shoulders narrower, still large, still calloused, folded in front of him. He looked at the catchalofen the way a person looks at a mirror that shows not the present face but an earlier one, a face that existed before a specific moment changed it permanently. Because it taught me the most important thing I ever learned. What thing? That the best man in the room can be the most wrong man in the room. At exactly the same time, the boy looked at him, not fully understanding. He would understand later, in a decade or two, when he encountered his own certainty for the first time, built his own authority, discovered the particular vertigo that comes when expertise encounters a truth it was not designed to accommodate. Crow pointed at the lintel stone above the firebox door. The carved letters, though softened by time, were still legible, cut deep enough into the limestone that weather touch. The passage of years had only smoothed their edges rather than erasing them. "Read what it says." The boy moved closer, squinted, traced the letters with his index finger, the way children read when they are sounding out unfamiliar words, using touch to supplement sight. Das Eisenschreit aber der Steine erinnert sich. He looked up. "What language is that, Grandpa?" "The language of a man who understood stone, a mining engineer. He wrote it in a journal. His son brought the journal to Kansas. His son died before he could build what the journal described. His son's wife found it. She built it instead. He paused. The light from the entrance fell across the cachalophon at an angle that picked out the carved English translation below the original. Read the bottom line. Iron shouts, but the stone remembers. The boy looked at the old stove, at his grandfather, at the earthen walls, the heavy ceiling, the profound quiet of a room surrounded by earth that held its temperature like a promise it had been keeping for decades. The woman who built this, was she a builder, like you? Crow smiled for the first time that afternoon. A small private expression that rearranged the lines of his weathered face into something gentler than his grandson had ever seen there. She was not a builder when she started. She was a widow with 2 children, a dead man's notebook, a pair of hands that bled every day for a month. She had an old man with bad lungs who helped her lift the stones she could not lift alone. He touched the cornerstone, the first stone, the one Silas Pruitt had laid, the foundation of everything. She was the only person in this town who thought to ask the question nobody else considered asking. What question? Crow's hand rested on the stone, cool now, patient, holding the memory of every fire it had ever contained, every winter it had defeated, every night it had spoken its quiet, radiant story to a room full of people who were warm because a woman had trusted a dead man's instructions over the judgment of every living expert in her world. What if everything we know about staying warm is wrong? The boy looked at the cachalophon, at the inscription, at the dim room that smelled of earth, of stone, of time. Was it wrong? Crow withdrew his hand from the stone, straightened as much as his aging spine permitted, looked at the structure one last time, not with the eyes of a builder, not with the eyes of an expert, but with the eyes of a man who had been humbled so completely, so necessarily, that the humbling had become the most valuable thing he owned. Every word of it, he said quietly. Every certain, confident, experienced word. He took his grandson's hand. They climbed the slope together, the old man leaning on the boy looking back over his shoulder at the dark entrance to the dugout. Above them, the wind moved through the bluestem grass with the lazy indifference of an October afternoon. The sky was wide. The light was gold. Somewhere below them, in the silent dark of the hillside, 2 tons of stone sat waiting for the next fire, the next winter, the next person who would press a palm against its surface, feel the warmth that lived inside it, understand, without needing to be told, that some things remember long after the shouting stops.